Dalton was frankly perplexed by Georgina's sudden message. He had had no word from the Clarendons since that stormy February evening when Alfred had declared him an outsider to his home, and he in turn had studiously refrained from communicating, even when he had longed to express sympathy after the doctor's summary ousting from office. He had fought hard to frustrate the politicians and keep the appointive power, and was bitterly sorry to watch the unseating of a man who, despite recent estrangements, still represented to him the ultimate ideal of scientific competence. Now, with this clearly frightened summons before him, he could not imagine what had happened. He knew, though, that Georgina was not one to lose her head or send forth a needless alarm. Hence he wasted no time, but took the overland which left Sacramento within the hour, going at once to his club and sending word to Georgina by a messenger that he was in town and wholly at her service. Meanwhile, things had been quiescent at the Clarendon home, notwithstanding the doctor's continued taciturnity and his absolute refusal to report on the dog's condition. Shadows of evil seemed omnipresent and thickening, but for the moment there was a lull. Georgina was relieved to get Dalton's message and learn that he was close at hand, and sent back word that she would call him when necessity arose. Amidst all the gathering tension, some faint compensating element seemed manifest, and Georgina finally decided that it was the absence of the lean Tibetans, whose stealthy, sinuous ways and disturbing exotic aspect had always annoyed her. They had vanished all at once, and old Margarita, the sole visible servant left in the house, told her they were helping their master and Surama at the clinic. The following morning, the 28th of May, long to be remembered, was dark and lowering, and Georgina felt the precarious calm wearing thin. She did not see her brother at all, but knew he was in the clinic hard at work at something, despite the lack of specimens he had bewailed. She wondered how poor Sanpo was getting along and whether he had really been subjected to any serious inoculation. But it must be confessed that she wondered more about Dick. She longed to know whether Surama had done anything for the faithful dog amidst his master's oddly callous indifference. Surama's apparent solicitude on the night of Dick's seizure had impressed her greatly, giving her perhaps the kindliest feeling she had ever had for the detested clinic man. Now, as the day advanced, she found herself thinking more and more of Dick, till at last her harassed nerves, finding in this one detail a sort of symbolic summation of the whole horror that lay upon the household, could stand the suspense no longer. Up to that time she had always respected Alfred's imperious wish that he be never approached or disturbed at the clinic. But as this fateful afternoon advanced, her resolution to break through the barrier grew stronger and stronger. Finally she set out with determined face, crossing the yard and entering the unlocked vestibule of the forbidden structure, with the fixed intention of discovering how the dog was, or of knowing the reason for her brother's secrecy. The inner door, as usual, was locked, and behind it she heard voices in heated conversation. When her knocking brought no response, she rattled the knob as loudly as possible, but still the voices argued on unheeding. They belonged, of course, to Surama and her brother, and as she stood there trying to attract attention, she could not help catch something of their drift. Fate had made her for the second time an eavesdropper, and once more the matter she overheard seemed likely to tax her mental poise and nervous endurance to their ultimate bounds. Alfred and Surama were plainly quarreling with increasing violence, and the purport of their speech was enough to arouse the wildest fears and confirm the gravest apprehensions. Georgina shivered as her brother's voice mounted shrilly to dangerous heights of fanatical tension. "You, damn you! You're a fine one to talk defeat and moderation to me. Who started all this anyway? Did I have any idea of your cursed devil gods and elder world? Did I ever in my life think of your damned spaces beyond the stars and your crawling chaos Nyarlathotep? I was a normal scientific man, confound you, till I was fool enough to drag you out of the vaults with your devilish Atlantean secrets. You egged me on, and now you want to cut me off. You loaf around doing nothing and telling me to go slow when you might just as well as not be going out and getting material. You know damn well that I don't know how to go about such things, whereas you must have been an old hand at it before the earth was made. It's like you damned walking corpse, to start something you won't or can't finish." Surama's evil chuckle came. "You're insane, Clarendon. That's the only reason I let you rave on when I could send you to hell in 3 minutes. Enough is enough, and you've certainly had enough material for any novice at your stage. You've had all I'm going to get you anyhow. You're only a maniac on the subject now. What a cheap, crazy thing to sacrifice even your poor sister's pet dog, when you could have spared him as well as not. You can't look at any living thing now without wanting to jab that gold syringe into it. No, Dick had to go where the Mexican boy went, where Sanpo and the other 7 went, where all the animals went. What a pupil. You're no fun anymore. You've lost your nerve. You set out to control things, and they're controlling you. I'm about done with you, Clarendon. I thought you had the stuff in you, but you haven't. It's about time I tried somebody else. I'm afraid you'll have to go. In the doctor's shouted reply, there was both fear and frenzy. Be careful, you. There are powers against your powers. I didn't go to China for nothing, and there are things in Alhazred's Azif which weren't known in Atlantis. We've both meddled in dangerous things, but you needn't think you know all my resources. How about the nemesis of flame? I talked in Yemen with an old man who had come back alive from the Crimson Desert. He had seen Irem, the city of pillars, and had worshipped at the underground shrines of Nug and Yeb. Ia Shub Niggurath. Through Clarendon's shrieking falsetto cut the deep chuckle of the clinic man. Shut up, you fool! Do you suppose your grotesque nonsense has any weight with me? Words and formulae, what do they all mean to one who has the substance behind them? We're in a material sphere now and subject to material laws. You have your fever, I have my revolver. You'll get no specimens, and I'll get no fever so long as I have you in front of me with this gun between. That was all Georgina could hear. She felt her senses reeling and staggered out of the vestibule for a saving breath of the lowering outside air. She saw that the crisis had come at last, and that help must now arrive quickly if her brother was to be saved from the unknown gulfs of madness and mystery. Summoning up all her reserve energy, she managed to reach the house and get to the library, where she scrawled a hasty note for Margarita to take to James Dalton. When the old woman had gone, Georgina had just strength enough to cross to the lounge and sink weakly down into a sort of semi-stupor. There she lay for what seemed like years, conscious only of the fantastic creeping up of the twilight from the lower corners of the great dismal room, and plagued by 1,000 shadowy shapes of terror which filed with phantasmal, half-limbed pageantry through her tortured and stifled brain. Dusk deepened into darkness, and still the spell held. Then a firm tread sounded in the hall, and she heard someone enter the room and fumble at the match safe. Her heart almost stopped beating as the gas jets of the chandelier flared up one by one, but then she saw that the arrival was her brother. Relieved to the bottom of her heart that he was still alive, she gave vent to an involuntary sigh, profound, long-drawn, and tremulous, and lapsed at last into kindly oblivion. At the sound of that sigh, Clarendon turned in alarm toward the lounge and was inexpressibly shocked to see the pale and unconscious form of his sister there. Her face had a death-like quality that frightened his inmost spirit, and he flung himself on his knees by her side, awake to a realization of what her passing away would mean to him. Long unused to private practice amidst his ceaseless quest for truth, he had lost the physician's instinct of first aid, and could only call out her name and chafe her wrists mechanically as fear and grief possessed him. Then he thought of water and ran to the dining room for a carafe. Stumbling about in a darkness which seemed to harbor vague terrors, he was some time in finding what he sought, but at last he clutched it in shaking hand and hastened back to dash the cold fluid in Georgina's face. The method was crude but effective. She stirred, sighed a second time, and finally opened her eyes. "You are alive," he cried, and put his cheek to hers as she stroked his head maternally. She was almost glad she fainted, for the circumstance seemed to have dispelled the strange Alfred and brought her own brother back to her. She sat up slowly and tried to reassure him. "I'm all right, Al. Just give me a glass of water. It's a sin to waste it this way, to say nothing of spoiling my waist. Is that the way to behave every time your sister drops off for a nap? You needn't think I'm going to be sick, for I haven't time for such nonsense." Alfred's eyes showed that her cool, common-sense speech had had its effect. His brotherly panic dissolved in an instant, and instead there came into his face a vague, calculating expression, as if some marvelous possibility had just dawned upon him. As she watched the subtle waves of cunning and appraisal pass fleetingly over his countenance, she became less and less certain that her mode of reassurance had been a wise one, and before he spoke she found herself shivering at something she could not define. A keen medical instinct almost told her that his moment of sanity had passed and that he was now once more the unrestrained fanatic for scientific research. There was something morbid in the quick narrowing of his eyes at her casual mention of good health. What was he thinking? To what unnatural extreme was his passion for experiment about to be pushed? Wherein lay the special significance of her pure blood and absolutely flawless organic state? None of these misgivings, however, troubled Georgina for more than a second, and she was quite natural and unsuspicious as she felt her brother's steady fingers at her pulse. "You're a bit feverish, Georgie," he said in a precise, elaborately restrained voice as he looked professionally into her eyes. "Why, nonsense, I'm all right," she replied. "One would think you were on the watch for fever patients just for the sake of showing off your discovery. It would be poetic, though, if you could make your final proof and demonstration by curing your own sister." Clarendon started violently and guiltily. Had she suspected his wish? Had he muttered anything aloud? He looked at her closely and saw that she had no inkling of the truth. She smiled up sweetly into his face and patted his hand as he stood by the side of the lounge. Then he took a small, oblong leather case from his vest pocket and taking out a little gold syringe, he began fingering it thoughtfully, pushing the piston speculatively in and out of the empty cylinder. "I wonder," he began with suave sententiousness, "whether you would really be willing to help science in something like that way, if the need arose. Whether you would have the devotion to offer yourself to the cause of medicine as a sort of Jephthah's daughter if you knew it meant the absolute perfection and completion of my work?" Georgina, catching the odd and unmistakable glitter in her brother's eyes, knew at last that her worst fears were true. There was nothing to do now but keep him quiet at all hazards, and to pray that Margarita had found James Dalton at his club. "You look tired, Al dear," she said gently. "Why not take a little morphia and get some of the sleep you need so badly?" He replied with a kind of crafty deliberation. "Yes, you're right, I'm worn out and so are you. Each of us needs a good sleep. Morphine is just the thing. Wait till I go and fill the syringe and we'll both take a proper dose." Still fingering the empty syringe, he walked softly out of the room. Georgina looked about her with the aimlessness of desperation, ears alert for any sign of possible help. She thought she heard Margarita again in the basement kitchen and rose to ring the bell in an effort to learn of the fate of her message. The old servant answered her summons at once and declared she had given the message at the club hours ago. Governor Dalton had been out, but the clerk had promised to deliver the note at the very moment of his arrival. Margarita waddled below stairs again, but still Clarendon did not reappear. What was he doing? What was he planning? She had heard the outer door slam, so knew he must be at the clinic. Had he forgotten his original intention with the vacillating mind of madness? The suspense grew almost unbearable, and Georgina had to keep her teeth clenched tightly to avoid screaming. It was the gate bell, which rang simultaneously in house and clinic, that broke the tension at last. She heard the cat-like tread of Surama on the walk as he left the clinic to answer it. And then, with an almost hysterical sigh of relief, she caught the firm, familiar accents of Dalton in conversation with the sinister attendant. Rising, she almost tottered to meet him as he loomed up in the library doorway, and for a moment no word was spoken while he kissed her hand in his courtly old-school fashion. Then Georgina burst forth into a torrent of hurried explanation, telling all that had happened, all she had glimpsed and overheard, and all she feared and suspected. Dalton listened gravely and comprehendingly, his first bewilderment gradually giving place to astonishment, sympathy, and resolution. The message, held by a careless clerk, had been slightly delayed, and had found him appropriately enough in the midst of a warm lounging-room discussion about Clarendon. A fellow member, Dr. McNeil, had brought in a medical journal with an article well calculated to disturb the devoted scientist, and Dalton had just asked to keep the paper for future reference when the message was handed him at last. Abandoning his half-formed plan to take Dr. McNeil into his confidence regarding Alfred, he called at once for his hat and stick, and lost not a moment in getting a cab for the Clarendon home. Surama, he thought, appeared alarmed at recognizing him, though he had chuckled as usual when striding off again toward the clinic. Dalton always recalled Surama's stride and chuckle on this ominous night, for he was never to see the unearthly creature again. As the chuckler entered the clinic vestibule, his deep guttural gurgles seemed to blend with some low mutterings of thunder which troubled the far horizon. When Dalton had heard all Georgina had to say and learned that Alfred was expected back at any moment with an hypodermic dose of morphine, he decided he had better talk with the doctor alone. Advising Georgina to retire to her room and await developments, he walked about the gloomy library, scanning the shelves and listening for Clarendon's nervous footstep on the clinic path outside. The vast room's corners were dismal despite the chandelier, and the closer Dalton looked at his friend's choice of books, the less he liked them. It was not the balanced collection of a normal physician, biologist, or man of general culture. There were too many volumes on doubtful borderland themes, dark speculations and forbidden rituals of the Middle Ages, and strange exotic mysteries in alien alphabets both known and unknown. The great notebook of observations on the table was unwholesome too. The handwriting had a neurotic cast, and the spirit of the entries was far from reassuring. Long passages were inscribed in crabbed Greek characters, and as Dalton marshaled his linguistic memory for their translation, he gave a sudden start and wished his college struggles with Xenophon and Homer had been more conscientious. There was something wrong, something hideously wrong here. And the governor sank limply into the chair by the table as he pored more and more closely over the doctor's barbarous Greek. Then a sound came, startlingly near, and he jumped nervously at a hand laid sharply on his shoulder. "What, may I ask, is the cause of this intrusion? You might have stated your business to Sarama." Clarendon was standing icily by the chair, the little gold syringe in one hand. He seemed very calm and rational, and Dalton fancied for a moment that Georgina must have exaggerated his condition. How, too, could a rusty scholar be absolutely sure about these Greek entries? The governor decided to be very cautious in his interview, and thanked the lucky chance which had placed a specious pretext in his coat pocket. He was very cool and assured as he rose to reply. "I didn't think you'd care to have things dragged before a subordinate, but I thought you ought to see this article at once." He drew forth the magazine given him by Dr. McNeil and handed it to Clarendon. "On page 542, you see the heading, 'Black Fever Conquered by New Serum.' It's by Dr. Miller of Philadelphia, and he thinks he's got ahead of you with your cure. They were discussing it at the club, and McNeil thought the exposition very convincing. I, as a layman, couldn't pretend to judge, but at all events I thought you oughtn't to miss a chance to digest the thing while it's fresh. If you're busy, of course, I won't disturb you." Clarendon cut in sharply. "I'm going to give my sister an hypodermic. She's not quite well. But I'll look at what that quack has to say when I get back. I know Miller, a damn sneak and incompetent, and I don't believe he has the brains to steal my methods from the little he's seen of them." Dalton suddenly felt a wave of intuition warning him that Georgina must not receive that intended dose. There was something sinister about it. From what she had said, Alfred must have been inordinately long preparing it, far longer than was needed for the dissolving of a morphine tablet. He decided to hold his host as long as possible, meanwhile testing his attitude in a more or less subtle way. "I'm sorry Georgina isn't well. Are you sure that the injection will do her good, that it won't do her any harm?" Clarendon's spasmodic start showed that something had been struck home. "Do her harm?" he cried. "Don't be absurd. You know Georgina must be in the best of health, the very best, I say, in order to serve science as a Clarendon should serve it. She at least appreciates the fact that she is my sister. She deems no sacrifice too great in my service. She is a priestess of truth and discovery, as I am a priest." He paused in his shrill tirade, wild-eyed and somewhat out of breath. Dalton could see that his attention had been momentarily shifted. "But let me see what this cursed quack has to say," he continued. "If he thinks his pseudo-medical rhetoric can take a real doctor in, he is even simpler than I thought." Clarendon nervously found the right page and began reading as he stood there clutching his syringe. Dalton wondered what the real facts were. McNeil had assured him that the author was a pathologist of the highest standing, and that whatever errors the article might have, the mind behind it was powerful, erudite, and absolutely honorable and sincere. Watching the doctor as he read, Dalton saw the thin, bearded face grow pale. The great eyes blazed, and the pages crackled in the tenser grip of the long, lean fingers. A perspiration broke out on the high, ivory-white forehead where the hair was already thinning, and the reader sank gaspingly into the chair his visitor had vacated as he kept on with his devouring of the text. Then came a wild scream as from a haunted beast, and Clarendon lurched forward on the table, his outflung arms sweeping books and paper before them as consciousness went dark like a wind-quenched candle flame. Dalton, springing to help his stricken friend, raised the slim form and tilted it back in the chair. Seeing the carafe on the floor near the lounge, he dashed some water into the twisted face and was rewarded by seeing the large eyes slowly open. They were sane eyes now, deep and sad and unmistakably sane, and Dalton felt awed in the presence of a tragedy whose ultimate depth he could never hope or dare to plumb. The golden hypodermic was still clutched in the lean left hand, and as Clarendon drew a deep, shuddering breath, he unclosed his fingers and studied the glittering thing that rolled about on his palm. Then he spoke, slowly and with the ineffable sadness of utter, absolute despair. "Thanks, Jimmy, I'm quite all right, but there's much to be done. You asked me a while back if this shot of morphia would do Georgie any harm. I'm in a position now to tell you that it won't." He turned a small screw in the syringe and laid a finger on the piston, at the same time pulling with his left hand at the skin of his own neck. Dalton cried out in alarm as a lightning motion of his right hand injected the contents of the cylinder into the ridge of distended flesh. "Good Lord, Al, what have you done?" Clarendon smiled gently, a smile almost of peace and resignation, different indeed from the sardonic sneer of the past few weeks. "You ought to know, Jimmy, if you've still the judgment that made you a governor. You must have pieced together enough from my notes to realize that there's nothing else to do. With your marks in Greek back at Columbia, I guess you couldn't have missed much. All I can say is that it's true. James, I don't like to pass blame along, but it's only right to tell you that Surama got me into this. I can't tell you who or what he is, for I don't fully know myself, and what I do know is stuff that no sane person ought to know. But I will say that I don't consider him a human being in the fullest sense, and that I'm not sure whether or not he's alive as we know life. You think I'm talking nonsense, I wish I were, but the whole hideous mess is damnably real. I started out in life with a clean mind and purpose. I wanted to rid the world of fever. I tried and failed, and I wish to God I had been honest enough to say that I'd failed. Don't let my old talk of science deceive you, James. I found no antitoxin and was never even half on the track of one. Don't look so shaken up, old fellow. A veteran politician fighter like you must have seen plenty of unmaskings before. I tell you, I never had even the start of a fever cure, but my studies had taken me into some queer places, and it was just my damned luck to listen to the stories of some still queerer people. James, if you ever wish any man well, tell him to keep clear of the ancient hidden places of the earth. Old backwaters are dangerous. Things are handed down there that don't do healthy people any good. I talked too much with old priests and mystics and got to hoping I might achieve things in dark ways that I couldn't achieve in lawful ways. I shan't tell you just what I mean, for if I did, I'd be as bad as the old priests that were the ruin of me. All I need say is that after what I've learned, I shudder at the thought of the world and what it's been through. The world is cursed old, James, and there have been whole chapters lived and closed before the dawn of our organic life and the geologic eras connected with it. It's an awful thought, whole forgotten cycles of evolution with beings and races and wisdom and diseases, all lived through and gone before the first amoeba ever stirred in the tropic seas geology tells us about. I said gone, but I didn't quite mean that. It would have been better that way, but it wasn't quite so. In places, traditions have kept on, I can't tell you how, and certain archaic life forms have managed to struggle thinly down the eons in hidden spots. There were cults, you know, bands of evil priests in lands now buried under the sea. Atlantis was the hotbed. That was a terrible place. If heaven is merciful, no one will ever drag up that horror from the deep. It had a colony, though, that didn't sink, and when you get too confidential with one of the Tuareg priests in Africa, he's likely to tell you wild tales about it. Tales that connect up with whispers you'll hear among the mad llamas and flighty yak drivers on the secret tablelands of Asia. I'd heard all the common tales and whispers when I came on the big one. What that was, you'll never know, but it pertained to somebody or something that had come down from a blasphemously long time ago, and could be made to live again, or seem alive again, through certain processes that weren't very clear to the man who told me. Now, James, in spite of my confession about the fever, you know I'm not bad as a doctor. I plugged hard at medicine and soaked up about as much as the next man. Maybe a little more, because down there in the Hagar country I did something no priest had ever been able to do. They led me blindfolded to a place that had been sealed up for generations, and I came back with Surama. Easy, James, I know what you want to say. How does he know all he knows? Why does he speak English or any other language for that matter without an accent? Why did he come away with me and all that? I can't tell you altogether, but I can say that he takes in ideas and images and impressions with something besides his brain and senses. He had a use for me and my science. He told me things and opened up vistas. He taught me to worship ancient, primordial, and unholy gods and mapped out a road to a terrible goal which I can't even hint to you. Don't press me, James. It's for the sake of your sanity and the world's sanity. The creature is beyond all bounds. He's in league with the stars and all the forces of nature. Don't think I'm still crazy, James. I swear to you I'm not. I've had too many glimpses to doubt. He gave me new pleasures that were forms of his Paleogean worship, and the greatest of those was the black fever. God, James, haven't you seen through the business by this time? Do you still believe the black fever came out of Tibet and that I learned about it there? Use your brains, man. Look at Miller's article here. He's found a basic antitoxin that will end all fever within half a century, when other men learn how to modify it for the different forms. He's cut the ground of my youth from under me, done what I'd have given my life to do, taken the wind out of all the honest sails I ever flung to the breeze of science. Do you wonder his article gave me a turn? Do you wonder it shocks me out of my madness back to the old dreams of my youth? Too late, but not too late to save others. I guess I'm rambling a bit now, old man. You know, the hypodermic. I asked you why you didn't tumble to the facts about black fever. How could you, though? Doesn't Miller say he's cured 7 cases with his serum? A matter of diagnosis, James. He only thinks it is black fever. I can read between his lines. Here, old chap, on page 551 is the key to the whole thing. Read it again. You see, don't you? The fever cases from the Pacific coast didn't respond to his serum. They puzzled him. They didn't even seem like any true fever he knew. Well, those were my cases. Those were the real black fever cases. And there can't ever be an antitoxin on Earth that'll cure black fever. How do I know? Because black fever isn't of this Earth, it's from somewhere else, James. And Sarama alone knows where because he brought it here. He brought it and I spread it. That's the secret, James. That's all I wanted the appointment for. That's all I ever did. Just spread the fever that I carried in this gold syringe and in the deadlier finger ring pump syringe you see on my index finger. Science, a blind. I wanted to kill and kill and kill. A single pressure on my finger and the black fever was inoculated. I wanted to see living things writhe and squirm, scream and froth at the mouth. A single pressure of the pump syringe and I could watch them as they died, and I couldn't live or think unless I had plenty to watch. That's why I jabbed everything in sight with the accursed hollow needle. Animals, criminals, children, servants, and the next would have been... Clarendon's voice broke and he crumpled up perceptibly in his chair. That, James, was my life. Sarama made it so. He taught me and kept me at it till I couldn't stop. Then it got too much even for him. He tried to check me. Fancy, he trying to check anybody in that line, but now I've got my last specimen. That is my last test. Good subject, James. I'm healthy, devilish healthy. Deuced ironic, though. The madness is gone now, so there won't be any fun watching the agony. Can't. A violent shiver of fever racked the doctor, and Dalton mourned amidst his horror stupefaction that he could give no grief. How much of Alfred's story was sheer nonsense, and how much nightmare truth he could not say. But in any case, he felt that the man was a victim rather than a criminal, and above all, he was a boyhood comrade and Georgina's brother. Thoughts of the old days came back kaleidoscopically. Little Alf, the yard at Phillips Exeter, the quadrangle at Columbia, the fight with Tom Cortlandt when he saved Alf from a pommeling. He helped Clarendon to the lounge and asked gently what he could do. There was nothing. Alfred could only whisper now, but he asked forgiveness for all his offenses and commended his sister to the care of his friend. You'll make her happy, he gasped. She deserves it. Martyr to a myth. Make it up to her, James. Don't let her know more than she has to. His voice trailed off in a mumble, and he fell into a stupor. Dalton rang the bell, but Margarita had gone to bed, so he called up the stairs for Georgina. She was firm of step, but very pale. Alfred's scream had tried her sorely, but she had trusted James. She trusted him still as he showed her the unconscious form on the lounge and asked her to go back to her room and rest, no matter what sounds she might hear. He did not wish her to witness the awful spectacle of delirium certain to come, but bade her kiss her brother a final farewell as he lay there calm and still, very like the delicate boy he had once been. So she left him, the strange, moonstruck, star-reading genius she had mothered so long, and the picture she carried away was a very merciful one. Dalton must bear to his grave a sterner picture. His fears of delirium were not vain, and all through the black midnight hours his giant strength restrained the frenzied contortions of the mad sufferer. What he heard from those swollen, blackening lips he will never repeat. He has never been quite the same man since, and he knows that no one who hears such things can ever be wholly as he was before. So for the world's good he dares not speak, and he thanks God that his layman's ignorance of certain subjects makes many of the revelations cryptic and meaningless to him. Toward morning, Clarendon suddenly woke to a sane consciousness and began to speak in a firm voice. "James, I didn't tell you what must be done about everything. Blot out these entries in Greek and send my notebook to Dr. Miller, all my other notes too that you'll find in the files. He's the big authority today, his article proves it. Your friend at the club was right. But everything in the clinic must go, everything without exception, dead or alive or otherwise. All the plagues of hell are in those bottles on the shelves. Burn them, burn it all. If one thing escapes, Surama will spread black death throughout the world. And above all, burn Surama. That thing must not breathe the wholesome air of heaven. You know now what I told you. You know why such an entity can't be allowed on earth. It won't be murder. Surama isn't human. If you're as pious as you used to be, James, I shan't have to urge you. Remember the old text, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, or something of the sort. Burn him, James. Don't let him chuckle again over the torture of mortal flesh. I say burn him, the nemesis of flame. That's all that can reach him, James, unless you can catch him asleep and drive a stake through his heart. Kill him, extirpate him, cleanse the decent universe of its primal taint, the taint I recalled from its age-long sleep. The doctor had risen on his elbow, and his voice was a piercing shriek toward the last. The effort was too much, however, and he lapsed very suddenly into a deep, tranquil coma. Dalton, himself fearless of fever, since he knew the dread germ to be non-contagious, composed Alfred's arms and legs on the lounge and threw a light afghan over the fragile form. After all, mightn't much of this horror be exaggeration and delirium? Mightn't old Doc McNeil pull him through on a long chance? The governor strove to keep awake and walked briskly up and down the room, but his energies had been taxed too deeply for such measures. A second's rest in the chair by the table took matters out of his hands, and he was presently sleeping soundly despite his best intentions. Dalton started up as a fierce light shone in his eyes, and for a moment he thought the dawn had come. But it was not the dawn, and as he rubbed his heavy lids he saw that it was the glare of the burning clinic in the yard, whose stout planks flamed and roared and crackled heavenward in the most stupendous holocaust he had ever seen. It was indeed the nemesis of flame that Clarendon had wished, and Dalton felt that some strange combustibles must be involved in a blaze so much wilder than anything normal pine or redwood could afford. He glanced alarmedly at the lounge, but Alfred was not there. Starting up, he went to call Georgina, but met her in the hall, roused as he was by the mountain of living fire. "The clinic's burning down," she cried. "How is Al now?" "He's disappeared while I dropped asleep," replied Dalton, reaching out a steadying arm to the form which faintness had begun to sway. Gently leading her upstairs toward her room, he promised to search at once for Alfred, but Georgina slowly shook her head as the flames from outside cast a weird glow through the window on the landing. "He must be dead, James. He could never live, sane and knowing what he did. I heard him quarreling with Surama and know that awful things were going on. He is my brother, but it is best as it is." Her voice had sunk to a whisper. Suddenly through the open window came the sound of a deep, hideous chuckle, and the flames of the burning clinic took fresh contours till they half resembled some nameless cyclopean creatures of nightmare. James and Georgina paused hesitant, and peered out breathlessly through the landing window. Then from the sky came a thunderous peal, as a forked bolt of lightning shot down with terrible directness into the very midst of the blazing ruin. The deep chuckle ceased, and in its place came a frantic, ululent yelp as of 1,000 ghouls and werewolves in torment. It died away with long, reverberant echoes, and slowly the flames resumed their normal shape. The watchers did not move, but waited till the pillar of fire had shrunk to a smoldering glow. They were glad of a half-rusticity which had kept the firemen from trooping out. and of the wall that excluded the curious. What had happened was not for vulgar eyes. It involved too much of the universe's inner secrets for that. In the pale dawn, James spoke softly to Georgina, who could do no more than put her head on his breast and sob. "Sweetheart, I think he has atoned. He must have set the fire, while I was asleep. He told me it ought to be burned, the clinic and everything in it, Surama too. It was the only way to save the world from the unknown horrors he had loosed upon it. He knew, and he did what was best. He was a great man, Georgie. Let's never forget that. We must always be proud of him, for he started out to help mankind and was titanic even in his sins. I'll tell you more sometime. What he did, be it good or evil, was what no man ever did before. He was the first and last to break through certain veils, and even Apollonius of Tyana takes second place beside him. But we mustn't talk about that. We must remember him only as the little Alf we knew, as the boy who wanted to master medicine and conquer fever. In the afternoon, the leisurely firemen overhauled the ruins and found 2 skeletons with bits of blackened flesh adhering. Only 2, thanks to the undisturbed lime pits. One was of a man, the other is still a subject of debate among the biologists of the coast. It was not exactly an ape's or a saurian skeleton, but it had disturbing suggestions of lines of evolution of which paleontology has revealed no trace. The charred skull, oddly enough, was very human, and reminded people of Surama, but the rest of the bones were beyond conjecture. Only well-cut clothing could have made such a body look like a man, but the human bones were Clarendon's. No one disputed this, and the world at large still mourns the untimely death of the greatest doctor of his age, the bacteriologist whose universal fever serum would have far eclipsed Dr. Miller's kindred antitoxin had he lived to bring it to perfection. Much of Miller's late success indeed is credited to the notes bequeathed him by the hapless victim of the flames. Of the old rivalry and hatred almost none survived, and even Dr. Wilfred Jones has been known to boast of his association with the vanished leader. James Dalton and his wife Georgina have always preserved a reticence which modesty and family grief might well account for. They publish certain notes as a tribute to the great man's memory, but have never confirmed or contradicted either the popular estimate or the rare hints of marvels that a very few keen thinkers have been known to whisper. It was very subtly and slowly that the facts filtered out. Dalton probably gave Dr. McNeill an inkling of the truth, and that good soul had not many secrets from his son. The Daltons have led on the whole a very happy life, for their cloud of terror lies far in the background, and a strong mutual love has kept the world fresh for them. But there are things which disturb them oddly, little things of which one would scarcely ever think of complaining. They cannot bear persons who are lean or deep-voiced beyond certain limits, and Georgina turns pale at the sound of any guttural chuckling. Senator Dalton has a mixed horror of occultism, travel, hypodermics, and strange alphabets which most find hard to unify. And there are still those who blame him for the vast proportion of the doctor's library that he destroyed with such painstaking completeness. McNeill, though, seemed to realize. He was a simple man, and he said a prayer as the last of Alfred Clarendon's strange books crumbled to ashes. Nor would anyone who had peered understandingly within those books wish a word of that prayer unsaid.